Good morning. I'm Steve Dollinger, President of the Georgia Partnership, and we are really happy to be here today. We're kicking off a whole series now of summits across Georgia, a celebration of rolling out the fifth edition of our Economics of Education. To have a group like this, which really is reflective of the partnership, business, government, community education leaders, that's our core stakeholder group, and we're glad you're here to share this day with us. As we get started, you can see on the agenda, and I'll go through the packet in just a minute, but you can see that first up is our friend Tim Carroll from the Metro Chamber. We are so appreciative they've let us have this first meeting here in Atlanta. And Tim, please come up and bring a welcome for us.
Thanks, Steve. When it comes to work in the education and workforce, which is a top priority for our investors here at the Chamber, we could not ask for a better partner than the Georgia Partnership. We rely on them for a lot of guidance, a lot of hand-holding on policy, and then for great opportunities like this to not only bring in those who are in education, but our investors who are very interested in how our educated workforce system is doing here, particularly in the metro area. But on behalf of our investors in the 29 county area, I want to thank the Georgia Partnership for your work and thank you for your expertise and welcome you all officially to the Chamber. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Tim is also an alum of our Education Policy Fellows Program. Many of you in this room might like to be in that. It's for business, government, education, community leaders. Actually, how many of our current or alum Education Policy Fellows are in the room? Raise your hand. Look at that. All right, fellows, glad to have you. It's exactly what we like in that kind of a program. This is our 10th year, but as we get into policy issues, we hope that there are a lot of those people who have been through our class who learn to become stronger advocates for education will continue to attend these and other meetings across Atlanta and the state. Next up, really glad to have Kevin Greiner with us today. Kevin is the CEO of Gas South. As you can see on the bottom of the program, they are a sponsor of our summits across the state. But actually, Kevin and I are more closer than that. He is one of our past chairs of the partnership. So Kevin, please come up, please.
Okay, so I'm Kevin Greiner, President and CEO of Gas South. We've been a proud supporter of the partnership for a long time. Our purpose at Gas South is to be a fuel for good. And when we talk about being a fuel for good, that's about caring for our customers and our employees and elevating our industry and our communities. And our relationship with the Georgia Partnership is certainly one which is very community-based. It's based on engaging on these really tough issues associated with education and providing the funding and the support that an organization like GPEE needs to be able to carry out its mission. This past year, we made a pledge to give back 5% of our profits every year to organizations that are working to help children in need. And GPEE, we believe, really epitomizes that mission and that goal of ours, and we're just so pleased to be able to work with them. You know, it's clear that a lack of education causes poverty. Because most jobs require the skills that people do not have if they don't pursue higher education. You know, at Gas South today, all of our jobs require a high school education, and most of them require some kind of post-secondary education as well. So, you know, it's when you look at some of these statistics and you see the number of folks who don't actually even graduate with a high school degree, they are shut out from working at a company like Gas South entirely. And that's a tragedy, and one that we definitely need to reverse here throughout Georgia. And in fact, even with our jobs that you might consider in the past that high school education was sufficient, say in our customer care organization, which is sort of the entry level for Gas South, we look for folks that are either have degrees, associate's degrees, bachelor degrees for those positions, or are working towards getting those, because we want to create a platform for our team members where they can move up into various areas of the company. And we're not about, dead-end positions where that's all you're going to do for the rest of your career. So when you look at education, it's about the here and now, but it's also about the future and how folks can grow and learn and create even more value at their companies as they continue to gain the experience and the skills that they need to thrive in today's economy. And this great report that we're going to be talking about today also shows that while a lack of education causes poverty, the causality also goes in the other direction. Poverty causes people to not pursue their education because other things get in the way, right? Bills, day-to-day things that are going on in their lives, just the various things that distract them from really pursuing what they know is the right thing to do, which is to continue to educate, build their skill set, continue to build those competencies and be able to take care of themselves and their families and contribute to this great economy that we have. So it's clear that we need to break this vicious cycle by investing more in education, as well as making higher education more financially accessible to especially lower and middle income individuals all the way across the birth to work spectrum. So the good news is, and we'll hear, I think, a little bit of good news today too, is that graduation rates are up over the last several years in Georgia. State funding has been restored. We've had economic wind at our backs, of course, and have great organizations like GPEE, Gears, I saw Stephanie earlier today, so many others that are in this room today that are working on the policy prescriptions and the breakthrough programs that can take us to the next level. So the 5th edition of the Economics of Education, it presents the data and the rationale for action. And I enjoyed reading through it over the last couple of days. Dana and her team always do a terrific job of presenting information in a very compelling and very easy to understand way. And starting with the opening thesis in the report, that education is key to Georgia's economic growth and prosperity. So thanks for being here. Thanks for engaging on these really important issues with us at GPEE, with your colleagues on these topics that are so critical for Georgia's success. Thanks again.
Thank you, Kevin. It's great to have board members who get it, who understand. Mike Donnelly with Wells Fargo and Kramer, some of our other board members are here. It's good to have that kind of support and help us keep the focus. Let me go through the packet real quickly. We've already talked about the agenda. You can see that. I'll go over some of the specifics on that in just a minute. Behind that are discussion questions that Dr. Dana Rickman will go over with you after the presentation and give you a chance just to turn together and have a brief conversation about some of the things that you'll be hearing. Last, the buff colored page there, the evaluation form, that's really, really important to us. We believe in continuous improvement, and we would love to be able to improve this session before we go to Macon next week and before we go to the next session after that. So please fill that out and leave it on your chair or drop it off the table on your way out, that we can have that kind of feedback. On the right side, we have the EdQuest material. This was from a Guazetta grant that gave us the last 2 years to be working on analysis of what are outstanding states and countries doing for success. And we identified 7 buckets, if you will. The first page under the clip there gives all 7 of those buckets. Dana will talk more about that in a few minutes. We use this stoplight kind of approach. So I know we have a lot of senators and representatives and some city council members here, others running for office. As we've been meeting with some gubernatorial candidates and state soup candidates, we'll use this to say the green is policy, good to go. Don't mess it up. Leave it alone. If it's yellow, it might need to be expanded or leveraged or better funded. If it's red, that's where we're dire straits in Georgia. Focus your education platform there. So the pages behind that are one each of each of the 7. And then, of course, if you're a policy wonk and you want to get into more, Dana and Caitlin have a couple hundred pages on our website of all the other research. I want to thank Stephanie Blank and Tuan Dogan for being on our steering committee. They were members with us all the way through, kind of helped guiding this piece over those 2 years, and it's great to see what a final product looks like. Then the rollout of this 5th edition of Econ of Ed, it really started back in 2004 when the Georgia Chamber asked us to help them with the messaging that stronger education, build a stronger workforce, build a stronger economy. That was kind of new language, new messaging way back then. It's more common now. Mike Gerber has helped us with the writing of this with his organization, cross-channel initiatives. We appreciate that, Mike. Thank you for helping. But this has grown for us. It's neat when you start a new thing and then you see it get legs. We've presented this to many chambers across the state, many school systems, getting ready to go down to Scriven to help that school system and the school board. We present this every year to the Georgia Academy of Economic Developers. There's 6 classes every fall, then 6 more every spring. Diane Hopkins, our executive VP, does that every year. Then Brian knows with GMA, Georgia Municipal Association, they ask us to make this into a 3-hour course for their members. So we go to their conference last several years and do a 3-hour course. To go beyond what Dana's doing in a few minutes, we will bring a panel of mayors and superintendents to talk about the critical role that mayors could play in their community, that sometimes they need to bring school systems and school boards and other community members together with the chamber to really make a difference. Schools can't do this load alone. And as I like to say, it's difficult for a school to outperform its community. So if we can make a community stronger, we're going to make schools stronger. So that's the things that we're rolling out today. As I mentioned, we're going to Macon next week. Then we'll be going across the state to basically the hub cities to share this. So if you have colleagues across the state and other organizations or sister organizations, please give them the heads up. The other information, the dates will be on our website soon. So with that, let's jump in, and Dr. Dana Rickman, our Vice President, will now go over the presentation. Think in your mind, please, about this. Confirm some of your data that you know. It may give you some new data because all this is very hot, very relevant. But also think about how you could leverage this with other community leaders or your chamber that we could help you carry the load. With that, Dana?
Good morning. I'm really excited to bring our new 5th edition of the Economics of Education to you this morning and a little follow-up around EdQuest. And I'm so happy to see so many of friendly faces in the audience, but also new people as well. As Steve mentioned, what we want to do this morning is really look at the importance of a strong educational pipeline and how that is actually an economic development strategy. So for those of you who are economic developers in the room, we always think about infrastructure and things like that. Part of your infrastructure is your educational system, from early learning all the way through post-secondary. And so hopefully we'll present some data for you that is, as Steve mentioned, probably familiar to you, but hopefully we'll bring some stuff that's a little new to you as well, so you get some new ideas and whatnot. But finally, what I want you to think about as you leave today is your role in moving the needle on educational outcomes for students and the economic competitiveness of your local community, our businesses, and the state. And sort of think about where we are as a state and where we need to go and how are we going to get there. There we go. So first we're going to start with examining the data for Georgia. And I will say that normally I'm a grazer. I wander around when I talk, but I've been tethered to the mic. So if I seem a little anxious, I'm really contained this morning. And I get really excited about data, so it's hard to contain me. Data, Dana, thank you. So where do we start? As we move through this presentation, we're going to talk about the major milestones of academic achievement: school readiness, literacy by 3rd grade, numeracy by 8th grade, high school graduation, and then workforce and post-secondary readiness. I don't see Ken Zeff in here, but there's Ken. For those of you who are familiar with or working with the Learn for Life, which is the Metro Atlanta Regional Educational Partnership, they use these same metrics to track how we are doing as a region in terms of educational outcomes for students and our future workforce. But also looking at this, as research tells us that we can't wait till the end of the pipeline to start intervening. As kids graduate from high school, we say, oh, they're not ready, what should we do? Conversely, we can't stop at the beginning either. As important as early learning is, we can't say, okay, they're ready for school, go forth and learn. We have to be cognizant across the entire pipeline. So let's start at the beginning. This is national data. It's a national snapshot that illustrates how poverty affects school readiness. On average, when children enter kindergarten, lower income children start kindergarten already behind their more affluent peers. These early learning gaps appear really early. And so later on, we're going to highlight how poverty plays out and these gaps play out across the entire pipeline. But this really highlights the importance of high quality early learning and getting ahead of these gaps before they really start to become much harder to address. Now I want to look at fourth grade reading. Is everyone familiar with NAEP, the National Assessment of Education Progress? We just had scores released, the most recent scores released last week, which was very exciting for all of us in the education field. We just kind of go a little crazy when NAEP scores come out. But NAEP is the one test that's given in every state across the country, and it really allows us to see how Georgia students are doing compared to students in other states in terms of being ready and on track for post-secondary and higher order learning. And these are some trends that we're looking at, and the reason we look at fourth grade reading is NAEP is given in the fourth grade, not the third grade, so it's a proxy for us. But there's a couple things going on in this slide that I'd like to highlight. You see Georgia is the green line on the bottom. The good news here is that the trend line is really positive. It's moving up relatively quickly. We have a much steeper slope than other states. We've been tied with or close to the national average on NAEP scores for a couple of years now. And so, we continually hear that narrative, and though less so recently, about how Georgia's last in education, how we're at the bottom of the barrel kind of thing. It's simply not true. As my mom would say, we're fair to Midland. Clearly not where we want to be, but we're certainly not at the bottom. I think we're doing a much better job than I think our education gets credit for, and especially in terms of business development and economic development. We have to get rid of that stigma because it's not right and it's not helping us. The bad news is that really, only a little over a third of our fourth graders are really at that level that we want to see them in terms of proficiency in language. But what's also interesting is I put up the 20th state. Yeah, you can see the red line up there. I can't point because I'm, again, tethered. The 20th state, like 38% of their fourth graders are reading on grade level. And I do the 20th state because it's nice to have sort of an aspirational goal, sort of an achievable aspirational goal. That's not a huge difference in the percent of students who are on grade level and those who are not. And so I like to highlight that to say, as we struggle with this grade level reading and proficiency, it's not a Georgia-specific problem. There's nothing inherently wrong or special about how Georgia is educating its students. This is something that the entire country is really struggling with and a challenge for. And so I think that's important to keep in mind. Now we look at 8th grade math. Some good news, but not great news. The good news is, again, much like reading, that we are ticking up at a pretty good rate. The bad news is that, we're still not anywhere near where we want to be. We're at a little over a third now of our 8th grade math students are proficient. We have continually been below the national average, though we are gaining ground. Again, this is a problem that the entire country is facing. Specific to Georgia, though, for those of you who are economic developers and thinking about the workforce in Georgia, where's our fastest growing industries? What do they typically have in common? Math, STEM, right? Science, technology, engineering, math. What does this slide just sort of portend for the future of our workforce? Yeah, no. I promise by the end we're going to have some good news, but we're going to be a little bit of a downer here for a minute. Here's some good news. High school graduation. We're definitely ticking in the right direction. In a relatively short amount of time, we've gone from about 73% to 81% of our kids are graduating, and this is on-time graduation rate. So within 4 years, 81% of our students are graduating. That's good news. The question I always get, though, is what percentage or how many of that 81% are actually ready for the rigors of college, career, going into the military? That answer, not as exciting. These are ACT test scores. And I'll tell you, if you do this analysis with the SAT, it's a very similar story. And what you're looking at is the percentage of students who took the ACT in reading and scored a score that is equivalent to, the research tells us they're basically ready to handle entry-level English classes in post-secondary, either four-year college or technical college post-secondary. Just as a disclaimer, as I talk about post-secondary throughout this presentation, I'm talking about all forms of post-secondary, associate's degree, workforce certificates, four-year degrees, all encompassing. But what we're looking at here, again, good news is we actually outpaced the national average. We're doing better than most states, or the average state. Bad news is, a little over half of our students who took the SAT got a score that says, yeah, when they go into freshman English, they're probably going to pass it. Like, they can handle that rigor. Also, thinking about, these are students who took the ACT, right? Those of us in research, and this is a self-selected sample. So these are kids, whether they enrolled in university or not, they were thinking ahead, saying, I want to go to post-secondary. So these are motivated kids. And so amongst that set of kids who were thinking about their future, who felt it was important and took the ACT, only about half probably aren't going to need remediation when they get there. Math, similar story to what we saw in the NAEP. We've been averaging around a little over 40% for a couple of years now. We've dropped from 44 to 41, but in statistical terms, it's really kind of a flat line. We're really not moving the needle there, and we got 60%, almost 60% of our kids who took the ACT probably can't handle entry-level math. They're going to need remediation. I think those of us in education know that if you need remediation going into post-secondary, the likelihood that you're going to graduate drops significantly low. It's a big expense for both the student, their families, and the university systems and technical college systems as well. So we have some work there to do. So shifting to our theme, economic development, what happens in Georgia for the impact of non-graduates? This slide I like to call my, well, duh slide, right? On the surface, it's pretty obvious. It's one of those slides that said, we've all seen versions of this, that on average, the more education you have, the more money you're going to make over your lifetime. Clearly, there's some exceptions to that. Everybody always points out, the guy who dropped out of college who now runs Microsoft or whatever. But generally speaking, the more education you have, the more money you're going to make over your lifetime. But what's interesting about this slide, I should probably figure out a way to do this slide because I always talk about it this way. As Steve mentioned, we've been doing the economics of education since 2004, and this is one of the slides that hasn't changed much. We just update the data. Coming out of, during the recession, depression, and coming out of it, that top number for the unemployment rate for bachelor's degree, that's now at like 2.3%, during our hardest economic times, that capped out about 4.5%, which is double. That's significant, right? But this bottom number, the 5.7, that capped out around 18%. And so what that tells me is that the less education you have, you're much more subjected to the winds of the economic cycle. So thinking about somebody who doesn't have a post-secondary degree or just has a high school degree, there's a good chance they're working in a field like construction, for example, which was a big economic driver in Georgia that was hit very hard by the recession. They get a job in construction, they take out a car loan so they can have a car to drive to and from their job. They get laid off because of an economic downturn, they can no longer pay on their car loan, their car gets repossessed, now they have a credit problem, and they have no transportation to try and interview for that next job. And you see how this cycle can build on itself, right? So that's part of the interesting part of the no-duh slide. Now I want to take a step back. We looked at the impact of the individual. What happens when they don't have more post-secondary credential? Let's take a step back and look at sort of the communities writ large. And think about communities that you may be from or communities that you work with that have a higher than average percentage of people who have not completed high school. And so we know you have overall lower lifetime earnings, but that translates to, within a community, reduced buying power, less tax revenue, less economic growth. So if I'm making less money, I'm not going to my local restaurants, I'm not going out to dinner, I'm not purchasing from I'm not trading goods and services, buying goods and services from my local industries. That takes a hit on the amount of money just flowing through the local economy. We also know that within communities, you have higher healthcare costs, criminal justice costs, higher public service costs. Less voting, less volunteering, lower rates of community involvement. This is really important because as we think about For those of you who are economic developers, community developers, if you want to revitalize your downtown, have a big renaissance in your downtown and get people coming into downtown, you need community engagement. You need civic involvement to help you do that. We've looked at the individual, we've looked at the community. We want to take one more step, let's back up maybe, 30,000 foot level. The economic impact of the amount of dollars we're actually talking about to the state. This is some analysis that was done, and there's more details in your book about this, by the Alliance for Excellent Education called the graduation effect. And they calculated if we went from where Georgia's graduation rate was, and this is based on when our graduation rate was 78%. So statewide, if we go from 78% to 90%, what does that do to the Georgia economy? Well, for one, we'll have $160 million in additional income annually. What does that mean to the individual? Within 10 years, statewide, if you have at least an associate's degree, as compared to someone who's a high school dropout, you're earning more than $15,000 a year annually. That's a lot of money. We'll have an additional $10.5 million in state and local tax revenue. Increase of $600 million in healthcare cost savings. How is that? Why is that? Oh, there it is. This is the percent of people either on public health insurance or with no health insurance at all in 2015, both of which cost the state money. And so if you're looking at high school dropouts, 71%, versus a high school graduate, 45%. And finally, an increase in $260 million in home sales. And those are just a couple of examples of the economic benefit that we would see. Now, if we take it down a little bit and we look at the metropolitan Atlanta area, and this data is based on the Census Bureau's definition of the metropolitan statistical area of Atlanta. So it's a little bit different than our broader county, but around here, we'd be looking at an increase of $120 million in additional income just for our region. Wages are a little higher in Atlanta than they are in the rest of the state. So if you have at least an associate's degree, you're going to earn on average more than $17,000 a year. $7.6 million in state and local revenue, $390 million in healthcare savings costs. And again, you see that comparison of high school dropouts versus high school graduates who are either on public health care or have no health care. And then finally, $190 million in home sales alone, just in our regional area. So as we go to the next slide, we sort of looked at a picture of economic impacts on a community, the potential gains to the state, if we were able to get that, and our region, if we were able to get that number up to 90%. So I want to turn to what are the barriers that we as a state and as a community are dealing with in terms of our economic development? Like, what's preventing us from getting to these numbers right now? So we're going to take a little sad turn, but then I promise we'll bring it back around. Poverty. Remember, I opened up with poverty and the achievement gap for our little kiddos, right? Well, look at these poverty rates. Green is where we have less than 20%. And then as we get more toward blue, and then orange is the worst. This is data that was done by the Georgia Chamber of Commerce when they were rolling out their Vision 2030 project. And so we cut and paste from them. But it's good data, and it's interesting that you look at this across the state. 59 of Georgia's 159 counties have a poverty rate of greater than 25%. And here we're talking about adult poverty. There's information on child poverty in your packets. Nationally, we rank 40th in terms of people, and 40th is the bad end of that ranking. Economic growth, adults not working, ages 25 to 64. Now, there are a lot of reasons why adults may not be engaged in the labor market, stay-at-home moms, people on disability. Those people have been factored out of this data. So these are people are able-bodied adults that should be engaged in the local economy, and they're not. And so we're looking at some counties in our state that have greater than 45% of their adult population not participating in the workforce. That's a problem. Thinking about if you're a business that's looking to invest in a county, or you're a statewide manufacturer and you're looking for customers, right, to buy your product, 45% of the adult population isn't working. That's an economic development problem. So one of the things you think about with your community, why are they not engaged in the labor market? Is it just a job training issue, right? Do they just need to go back to the technical college, get some skills, and get re-engaged? Is it a literacy problem? We have a significant problem of adult literacy in our state that a lot of our partners are really beginning to look at. Do we need more adult literacy to get people so they can get to basic levels of literacy to participate in the job market? Is it just the education level? Do they not have the education credentials that they need? Which leads us to our third barrier. These are adults who do not have a high school diploma. And again, we have communities in our states, counties in our states, where more than a quarter of the adult population doesn't even have a high school diploma. So when you add these together, you can kind of see, everybody know where the gnat line is, right? It's not a perfect correlation, but you can see it's a high correlation of where we have high poverty rates, high percentages of adults not working, high percentages of adults with no high school diploma. The metropolitan Atlanta area clearly looks like and is the economic engine for our state. So for those of you who are just concerned with Metro Atlanta, you can be like, oh, I'm good. These statistics are getting worse. It's not like we've plateaued and suddenly it's changed, right? So as Atlanta isn't big enough to carry the whole state much longer. So in terms of our state's long-term economic development and viability, some of these trends have to change. Now my guess is most of you in this room aren't just concerned with just Metro Atlanta. Many of you represent statewide agencies, statewide businesses. This is a concern for all of us. There we go. So what do? We've looked at the impact of high school non-graduation, what the impact could be, and sources and potential barriers to address. So how do we overcome these barriers and get that economic potential that we started with? Well, first, we start with the foundations. Get kids ready for kindergarten. Healthy births, high quality early learning. Moving to K-12, literacy by third grade, numeracy, high school graduation. These are the things we all know, the benchmarks that we've talked about. And then finally, post-secondary. How do we get more credentialed adults working? 2- and 4-year high school completion. And again, this is the same pathway that Learn for Life is working on in our metro region. And I will, just a quick plug for Learn for Life. If you come back here next Tuesday morning, we get a whole briefing on that. So if you really want to dive in, I encourage you to see Ken and sign up. So we start there. We call this slide the early catastrophe slide. Language development is one of the foundations of successful learning. If you miss language development, you can have a really hard time being a successful learner. And we saw the gaps early on in the slide. Look what happens. This is vocabulary development. When kids are 12 months old, we don't see much of a difference. Though I will tell you, personal anecdote, I've got 2 little 11-month-olds at home right now. And while they don't have vocabulary per se, they are talking up a storm. And when I talk back to them, or my husband talks back to them, or our friends talk back to them, they respond and they're engaged and they're hearing the words that we're saying. By the time we get to, again, I'm tethered, this is killing me, 24 months, we start to see a gap here, right? Based on family income. And then finally, when we get to 36 months, research tells us there's a 30 million word gap. Now, these aren't 30 million different words. Let me be clear about that. I see everybody trying to count up the number of words that they know. Just the number of words that they hear over time, right? And so this is 36 months. That's only 3 years old. By the time these kids are getting into pre-K, which is one of our best defenses against these gaps in getting kids ready to school, they're coming into pre-K already with big gaps. We can't wait. We got to start early. Also, foundations. Steve mentioned this earlier, and we're going to do some work around this. Caitlin and I, with the help of a lot of people in this room, we did the research. We asked the question a couple years ago, what are other high-performing states and nations doing? What do they all have in common, right? You put that Venn diagram together, what does that look like, right? And we came up, these 7 buckets, as Steve calls them. And unfortunately, I was really hoping for like a silver bullet, like that one thing they're all doing that we hadn't thought of, like, education solved. I didn't find it, I'm sorry to say. But these are the 7 that we came up with, and you have the handouts here. And just very briefly, foundations for early learning. We talk a lot about high quality early learning. It's essential. That's especially important, but the foundations for early learning goes beyond that. When the kids are little, do they have access to health care? Are there access to family support? So it's a supportive family environment that these little kids are in to get them ready for post-secondary. So we're talking about health, we're talking about community effects, we're talking about education, all of these things from really early on. Quality teaching, I think as all of us know, nothing more powerful than a high quality teacher in every single classroom. However, you can have the best teacher on the planet, and if he or she is not surrounded by quality leadership, both within the school, district, state level, they will not be as effective as they could be. Advanced instructional system, this really dives into what happens in the classroom. Do we have strong curriculum? High rigorous standards. So we have a good assessment system that really is aligned to the standards that helps teachers instruct and also lets us know how our kids are doing and progressing. Pathways to post-secondary success. This covers everything from the career pipelines that we have in our secondary high schools and also transitions into post-secondary. Do kids know what they need to study when they get there? Are they getting through in efficient ways? And also importantly, can they afford it? Like, are we giving the supports for all of our students to successfully complete their chosen pathways? 6th area, look down here, supported learning environments. This is both within the classroom and outside. Within the schools, we're talking about school climate and the importance of nurturing school environments. Are kids happy to be there? Are the teachers happy to be there? Is it a place where learning is respected and strived for, right? But also, as important, if not more so, what happens outside the classroom? Are there wraparound services? Is it a high crime area? As Steve mentioned earlier, it's very difficult for a school to outperform its community, right? What does that community look like, and how can the community and the schools support each other? And then finally, adequate and equitable funding kind of underpins everything. Are we properly resourcing all of these categories so that all of our students can succeed? And so we'll get back to this. I put this up there because Georgia has been working on those foundations for a while, and we're making some progress. But education does not happen in a vacuum, right? One of the things that is facing Georgia is the changing face of Georgia, our changing demographics. Probably a lot of you have seen slides similar to this. This is based on the most recent 2 census data. So it's relatively old. We're getting ready to have another census. So these numbers are even probably more extreme now. But what this shows, this is the fastest growing populations within the state. Now the top 2 categories, Hispanic and Asian, the only reason that's a concern is that that brings a lot more ELL, English language learners, into our classrooms. So schools need to adjust their resources and their teaching to accommodate these students for them to be successful. Those growing population is not a problem. We just need to be able to address the needs of especially ELL students and students from other cultures and whatnot, and to honor that. And I think ultimately it makes our state stronger to be very multicultural and diverse. What is a problem, what's a significant problem, is that 3rd category, the students who are living in poverty. This number is growing every day and getting worse. For example, in 2006, and this is measured by how we think about free and reduced price lunch, who's enrolled in free and reduced price lunch program in the school. In 2006, 42% of our students in K-12 were enrolled in free and reduced price lunch. That's actually a pretty big number, right? More than 40%. By 2017, it was over 62% of our students. That is a huge growth and a huge burden on our schools to serve these students. And don't get me wrong, there are really a lot of smart kids living in poverty. There's nothing to do with their cognitive abilities or anything like that. But frankly, I don't know about you, but if I haven't had breakfast, I'm grumpy. And I can't work well with others, and I can't focus on my job, and I'm not a good team player, and that's just if I skip breakfast, right? And I'm an adult with some modicum of self-control. Think about little kids who possibly haven't eaten since the Friday before when they had their school lunch coming in Monday morning. When I move, I'm always out of sorts. Like if I'm between homes, I'm just like, oh, I can't just, because everything's, it's the kids that don't have safe and stable housing. They're afraid to go home, or they're afraid to leave their house because of the poverty in their neighborhood. Maybe there's a lot of crime. All of that schools have to deal with, and more than 60% of our population falls into that. So what does that mean, though, for the educational outcomes we've been talking about? Let's look at some achievement gaps. Again, these are based on NAEP scores. So we were talking about how Georgia had a pretty good upward slope, even for math, where we had 35% and 31%. Looking at especially that low-income category, 25% and 20%. If more than 60% of our kids fall into this category, and we want those 30% numbers to go up fast, what's going to happen? Who's good at math? What's going to happen to that slope? Are we going to continue to go up, especially at an accelerated rate? No, the answer's no. Shout it out, no. And then high school graduation as well. Not as big of a gap, but still concerning that our largest subgroup isn't really, isn't hitting our average. So our average isn't going to go up if that subgroup keeps growing, and it is continuing to grow. So there's a disconnect. We need a foundation to make sure all kids are reading on grade level. We can't do business as usual because we're not going to get there. Another way to look at this was calculations done by our friends at Atlanta Regional Commission. We have a random 100 ninth graders in our high school. 81 are going to graduate on time. Again, this is all on-time graduation rate. So I'll grant you that we're going to pick up another couple as time goes by. But 81, that's good news. Even better news, 62 are going to enroll in higher education. We have a 62% enrollment rate from high school to post-secondary. I find that very encouraging, meaning the average student understands that they need to go on to something more, right? This is where it all kind of falls apart, though. Of those 62, only 43 are going to make it to their sophomore year. And I'm not talking about credential completion. I'm not talking about anything other than getting into their sophomore year. We're losing 57% of our kids between ninth grade and sophomore year of post-secondary. We'll pick up a few more as time goes by, but even if we pick up half, which is optimistic, we still have a problem because what's happening in our labor market? Again, this was done by the Georgia Chamber of Commerce. Look at job change between 2015 and 2025. 2015, we had a little more than 4.5 million jobs. Come on, 2025. By the end of 2025, we're going to add 387,000, right? Bringing us to about 4.9 million. So we need an additional 387 for new jobs coming on the market for us. But that's not it. That's not all. We're going to need another 1.1 million in replacement. Along with our demographic shifts, not only are we changing in terms of income and ethnicity and race, we're aging as a population. So people like Steve Dollinger are going to be retiring by 2025, right? So we replace Steve, so then we only need 1,151,227 replacement people. So other than education policy head, we mentioned this earlier, where are our fastest growing jobs? These are the top growing industries in our state: healthcare, professional science, and technology. Those are going to grow around 19 and 17% respectively. This is statewide. Different regions have a couple of other different things that are growing, but generally speaking, again, we're talking about STEM, science and math. Currently, and this is supported by some great research done by the Metro Atlanta Chamber, Georgia is experiencing a talent gap. And the talent gap is the mismatch between the degrees and skills needed by the employers, which we've talked a lot about STEM, but other skills as well, versus the degrees and skills of the population. That's a problem we have today, right now. That's not going to solve itself on its own, especially looking at our trajectories here. So what do we need for our economic development pipeline? I think this is one of those stats that you have all heard before. 60% of the jobs by 2020 will require some form of higher education. Y'all, it's 2018. That's just 2 years from now. When we first started doing this, 2020 was like, oh, it's like a decade from now. We'll get there, whatever. No, it's 2 years away. Currently, we've just updated these numbers from Complete College, Georgia. This is getting better. It used to be 42. About 48% of our adult population, right, have some sort of post-secondary degree. The goal set by the state to meet our 60%, we need 250,000 new graduates by 2025. That goal used to be 2020, but as time went by, they're like, okay, we'll give us another 5 years. So this is where we are. We need 250,000 new graduates by 2025, and I'll tell you, they can't all come from the K-12 pipeline. There's not enough kids in it. Even if we got to that 95% graduation rate, we need to be looking at our adult learners as well. Who amongst that, what did we say, the percentage of adults who are not engaged in the workforce, we need to be bringing them back in. We need to get them educated, they need to be literate, they need to be retrained. So this is sort of an encompassing problem that we just can't rely on the K-12 system to solve this for us. So what are we looking at? Over the past 5, 6, 7 years or so, we have increasing academic rigor and expectations from our K-12 system. Absolutely the right move to do. Things are a lot more complicated now. We're a lot more competitive. We've raised expectations. We've raised standards. We've upped our curriculum. We are asking more from our students and from our teachers and from our educational system. At the same time we did that, though, we have changing demographics. And so our fastest growing subpopulation, subgroups of kids, are kids that traditionally needed more support to excel with these increasing academic rigors and standards. At the same time, it's my last one, we have an increasing demand for a highly skilled labor force. So the first two match up. We need a highly skilled labor force, so we increase standards and rigor to meet that need with a population that traditionally has not. So what does that mean for us? If we do nothing different, I mean, we as a state, as communities, if we do nothing different, are we headed for a perfect storm? And I'm talking about our economic development. I use the term perfect storm intentionally and carefully because a perfect storm will sink all boats. It doesn't matter if you're a little raft on the choppy water or you're the Queen Elizabeth II, moored to the side of a dock that you think is safe and secure and, gated off from everybody else. It will sink our entire economy if we do nothing different. But the good news is, see, here's where we turn. Told you it was coming. I think all of us are in this room because we are doing stuff different and we want to figure out what more can we do different. I don't think this is our economic future. I don't think anybody in this room will allow that to happen. So what are we doing different? Positive collective impact. Learn for Life is an example for that. Literacy Action is an example for that. We are coming together in ways as communities, as partners that we've never done before. And that's what we need as a state. So what can we do? I think Kevin alluded to this earlier. I'm going to take a step back for a minute and think about the economic life cycle and think about what we want, what really works for us. The healthy economic life cycle. Kids are born, they go through early learning, they go through the educational system, come out the other side, they're successful adults, they have healthy families, they congregate in successful communities, and then they send their kids back into early learning, and the cycle repeats, right? This is the healthy economic life cycle. This is the American dream. This is the growing pie, economic pie that says, I will probably do better than my parents and economically, and hopefully my children will do better than me. We're all growing. That's what we want, and that's where we want everybody to be. However, what has happened is there's cracks in this pipeline. See, cracks. What happens with those cracks? Well, things begin to fall apart, and people begin to fall out of it. And when you fall out of that the healthy economic cycle, you drop out of high school. We already talked about the lower earnings and what happens to communities. What happens to communities in particular who have high concentrations of high school dropouts, right? These impoverished, disinvested communities, these people are still having kids and children, more likely to be low birth weight babies, more likely to be exposed to toxic stress in the home. These kids are going into early learning, and early learning does everything they can to close that gap, but they can't do everything. And as that cycle grows, what's been happening in Georgia is more and more people have been falling out of the healthy economic cycle and into this poverty cycle. And that's what's going to sink our state if we don't shore it up. So how do we shore it up? We insulate, there we go. We insulate that pipeline. And that's where all of us in the room come in. Is it not insulating? Can't tell. There we go. That the public education system does a pretty decent job of getting kids through the pipeline. If we think about a pipe like a water pipe in your house and you turn on the faucet and water doesn't come out, there's one of two reasons why water may not be flowing out. One, there may be a clog in the pipe. Public education, and there's great partnerships between Department of Early Care and Learning, K-12, post-secondary. Those partnerships could be better, and they're working on it, but there's good partnerships to really look at the flow of the water, getting kids through successfully. But there's other reasons why, even if your pipe is fully open, you turn on that water, nothing comes out. Why would that be? Anybody ever been in your kitchen and look up and see a water stain? You're like, oh no. There's cracks, right? Everything has leaked out. Or there's no water even flowing in anymore. Something else has happened, right? This is where most of the people in this room come in. How do we insulate that pipeline? If you're a local community person, high quality childcare, community engagement, academic supports and job training. If you're an elected official thinking about your local community, what's the transportation system look like? Can parents actually get to and from jobs and get their kids to and from those important after-school enrichment programs that we keep talking about? How's the local health care? Is there access for children to get their immunizations and well baby checks? Is there safe and stable housing for families? What does the financial institutions look like in your local community? Are there banks? There are many disinvested communities that there's no bank. And so if you can't bank, you can't generate any kind of wealth. All of these things help insulate that pipeline to get kids through and try to break that poverty cycle. So we're circling toward the end, so hang in here with me. What are the things that could cause some of the cracks? As you look at your local communities, it's very important to look at the data and do sort of causal analysis of what's causing the cracks, right? So I'm going to throw up some data just as an example, and we like to call these pasta slides, because as soon as I hit this button, it's going to be like pasta spilled out all over. But I want you to look at, see if you can find your local county on this. So the first one, we're just going to do about two of these. For example, teen birth rates, right? If you look at Georgia, okay, I'm going to walk, Brian, I'm sorry. Where's Georgia? Georgia's the blue line, slowly going down. But look at Clayton, our top, it's getting a lot better. And we got Fayette down here. You don't have to shout out, but just think about what are some fundamental differences between Clayton and Fayette counties? What might be contributing in those counties to differential rates in teen pregnancies and teen birth rates? Same question of percent teens not working or not in school, kind of the precursor to that other slide of the percentage of adults in your county that weren't working or weren't in school. And what's interesting to me looking at this, again, we've got sort of bookended by Clayton and Fayette, but they're trending in the right direction. Looks like, I think it's Henry. Rockdale and Henry, since the recession, that's going up. So if I was working in these counties, I'd want to ask why. Like, what happened? Is there a drug epidemic that kids are now stoned and dropping out? Is it a transportation thing? Like, what? I'm randomly guessing. I have no idea what's going on in those counties, but some of you may be from those counties. Like, dig into what's happening there that may be driving those numbers. That's how you shore up that crack in that pipeline. And we talked about the impact of poverty. And we started with the kids knowing all their letters going into kindergarten. These are the same counties kind of ordered by percent free reduced price lunch in the county. You see the state average is 62%. You have Clayton as high as 99% and Fayette down to 25%. Remember, they were our bookends on our pasta slides. So what happens if I overlay third grade reading in terms of outcomes? Not a perfect correlation, but it's pretty tight. Do the same thing for 8th grade math. Do the same thing for high school graduation. As Kevin said earlier in his opening remarks, poverty is both a cause and effect of the educational pipeline, the cracks that we see. How do we think about addressing it? How do we think about insulating it? And I'll just give you a couple of really concrete examples. How do you insulate around early childhood? Read to a child every day. The Get Georgia Reading Campaign has a great program called Talk With Me Baby. And it's a whole program that has a whole thing to it. And I encourage you to Google it and look it up. But at the very least, talk to babies. You see a kid, start reading to them. Ask the parents first, but generally they'll probably say yes. They'd be thrilled that someone else is reading to their kid, right? K-12 system. Again, Get Georgia Reading, get everybody reading by third grade. But there's really a great mechanism around partnerships between businesses, post-secondary, dual enrollment, keeping kids engaged and excited about what they're learning and having them understand that this is something that could be helpful to their future. That's really going to cut away at our dropout rates. We have the college and career academies across Georgia, which is a great example of keeping kids engaged and excited about being in school, and they have an excellent track record. And then again, on post-secondary, if you're a business leader, what kind of apprenticeships and internships can you offer within the post-secondary? And I can't hit this hard enough because I don't think we do it often enough, is thinking about our adult population. The Go Back, Move Ahead program is one of Governor Deal's initiatives, which is really great, thinking about the adults that are out in your community that have some post-secondary. Maybe they're a credit short. Maybe they're like a semester short from getting that degree or diploma or credential. How do we get them back get that training efficiently and effectively, and then get them back out in the workforce? And then again, adult literacy efforts. I think that is something that's holding us back as a state that I appreciate the leaders in the room that have taken the initiative on trying to highlight. We have Literacy for All that's really looking at that. And if you take the K-12 and post-secondary system together, Grow Your Own is something that has really taken hold in Georgia. It's probably essential for our rural communities, but I think it could be something that's important for different communities within metro area as well. And thinking about how businesses, post-secondary, and the K-12 system can work on building up their local talent. Like if you are in East Point and you are running a factory or a business in East Point, what kind of labor do you need? What kind of skills do you want coming out of the education system in East Point, locally grown? Stay home, work here, raise your family, work together to figure out, don't send kids away or hope that they come back. Get them excited about being where they are. So I think a lot of us may live here. If your efforts aren't aligned, whether you're a business or a school, and you just have a lot of people, all very well-intentioned people, doing a lot of great work, but just kind of in a silo, you're not going to really push much on your goal. I think there's been tremendous movement that a lot of communities are actually here. They're trying to get together. You'll have the local chamber doing an initiative. The grade level reading campaign has come in and done an initiative. You have the Kiwanis Club doing an initiative. And there's probably one or two people that are on all of those different initiatives, but generally they're not fully integrated with each other. And so they're a little better about moving that goal, about whatever that goal is for your community. Is it promote early learning? Is it looking at literacy? Is it looking at 8th grade math? Finally, this is where we want to be. This is collective impact. This is positive power. And this is very powerful. And so start aligning your work and what outcomes you want to see with other people, sometimes outside of your own industry. Something we've all done in education, or we're getting better at anyway. We've not done it, but we're getting better at it, is think about who are our partners in behavioral health? Who are our partners in physical health? Who are our partners in housing to help stabilize the kids in our schools? How do we reach out across those lines and align our efforts to the goals that we want? Which takes us to our small group activity that I want you guys to do today. I want to take some time for you all to sort of reflect on what we've presented here today. Hopefully it was a little bit new or a different twist on stuff that you already knew, and think about your work and how you can get to that third, lining up these kind of bullets. So we're going to go into a small group. Our vision for this exercise was that everybody would be at tables and have sort of a table discussion, but turn to your nearest friend or 2 or 6, and you guys can do this together. You're all adults. I suspect you can work it out. Let's go back to EdQuest, and the reason these are in your folder. As Steve mentioned, this first page, and these are all front and back, by the way, so don't forget to flip it over. We've gotten a couple people say, you said there were 7. There's only 3. Now flip it over. They're all there. Summary statements of best practice policy. In terms of policy in Georgia, what we need to help move that needle forward. And again, thinking about foundational policies, I think the way I like sort of imagery. It helps me process things. We're thinking about a blueprint for a house. What are the essential elements that every house needs? You need a floor, ceiling, walls. We want a high-performing house, right? So we need plumbing, an HVAC system, wiring for a stereo, right? But every single house, the blueprints all have the same essential elements. That's what we're talking about here, the structure to allow local districts, local communities to decide for themselves, you know, do we want craftsman? Do we want Art Deco? Do we want hardwood floors? Do we want carpet? You know, what kind of kitchen do we want? All this other kind of stuff. We're not talking about the particular details or particular programs, but we're talking about the structural integrity of the policy that supports everything else. So that's what these are. Suggestion, best practices around that. And then for each of these, as Steve pointed out, there's an additional with more information. And on the front, oops, excuse me, is, you know, I love data, are all the benchmarking data and sort of descriptions of what best practices in this area look like, and then the data sort of ranking Georgia compared to other states. And then on the back are the same policy recommendations as the summary sheet with just a little more information. And so that's for each of the 7. So what I want you to do for like the next 5 to 10 minutes, in your packet, Steve pointed out, there's a sheet with these questions on it. And I want you guys to get together and think through for your either your business or your community or your advocacy group what you'd like to see. Ours is just a list of suggestions of where we need to start. Some of them are going to speak to you more than others. You all have your own priorities. We're interested in what areas are most relevant to your work or your community, right? And then of those that are relevant, which is your highest priority? You have to start somewhere. You can't work on everything at the same time. Where would you start? And then also, finally, I want to know who else should be or is working on this, thinking about aligning your arrows. As Steve mentioned, we are always interested in continuous improvement at the partnership as well. And so we'll be snatching up your sheets. If you don't mind, we can read chicken scratch, just kind of write down some of your ideas. We'll take them back from you because it helps us prioritize our work as well if we know what areas our communities are interested in. So we'll take about 5 to 10 minutes, talk amongst yourselves, and I'll put the essential elements back up there for you. Thank you.
Focus on the 7-6. All the teachers for the 7-6. And what do we do with the all of them?
All right, as we come toward the end of our program, what I'd like to do is just, we're not going to go group by group or anything like that, but for those of you who so feel moved to sort of share with the broader group about what you guys talked about and where some of your priorities may be, raise up your hand and let's have a sort of an open discussion. Who wants to go first? And if I know you, I may call on you. Okay. Lisa Marie. Tell us your name and where you're from, and then talk about your priorities.
Hi, I'm Lisa Marie Haygood, and I'm with Georgia PTA.
Lisa Marie, there's a...
Thank you. I'm with Georgia PTA, and I also serve as the executive director for the Cherokee County Educational Foundation. I had a great opportunity to speak with Irene and Miss Yvonne, who's here with NCR. One of the things that we focused on was on foundations for learning, areas most relevant to our community. And one of the problems that Irene pointed out to us is that here on this sheet, we have great exposure to kids in K through 12. I hail in Cherokee County, and we have put unequal resources where there's greater need, focusing on making the best schools, our Title I schools, putting the highest level, the most qualified, brilliant instructional folks into those schools, and it's helped to raise up and improve those communities. But we have very little access to the kids prior to kindergarten, and there's a gap there for us, and we didn't see in this order of concerns housing that's affordable, and that's a big kickback in our communities. We have folks who live in mobile homes if they're in terms of poverty, but if we want to bring in apartments or townhomes or even $100,000 houses, there's so much kickback and resistance in the community to that, the element that it will bring in, and so we don't improve in those areas. And I would like to see that included as you guys talk about the essential elements for improving this.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Safe and affordable housing is such a huge issue. Yes, Adrina, go ahead. Someone has a mic?
Good morning. I'm Adria Kitchens with One Small Change. And we talked about the adult learning population. You know, the governor has had a huge focus on reentry. We look at mass incarceration and how that has caused, like, it's a huge contributor to the gap that we see. And we were talking about ways in which we could start to talk to employers about looking at non-traditional education as a value, allowing people's life experience to be a value, because how do we start to pull in those people, right, who are reentering our society and put them back in a positive place where they can work and become sustainable and be a part of the life cycle and the pipeline.
Thank you for pointing that out. We're talking about adult reentry in the former prison population and how do we get the adults engaged. And I thought it was interesting. I think one of the really great things that Governor Deal has done for us has been his justice reform policies, both juvenile justice and adult justice systems. And I remember hearing a speech that he was talking about when he was rolling out his Education Reform Commission. And he said that he felt that this was actually just an extension of his focus on justice reform. That if we get the educational system strong, we don't have to worry about the justice system as much anymore. And so there's such a tight link between juvenile justice, adult justice, shoring up those cracks in the pipeline. Yes, ma'am.
Cynthia Briscoe Brown, Atlanta Board of Education. I want to second everything Lisa Marie said about affordable housing in a school where 2/3 of the kids on day one will be different on the last day of school. It's really hard to move that needle in any areas, and the main reason for that is housing instability. So I want to second all that, but what we talked about in our group, we were struck by the fact that while we understand and agree with the emphasis on STEM subjects and STEM learning, the slide about the demographic changes brought up to us a need for multilingual education.
Yes.
In Atlanta Public Schools, we're moving ahead with dual language immersion in a big way and are seeing great results, but would like to see we believe that language learning not only improves outcomes in both reading and in STEM subjects, but also prepares our kids for the workforce no matter what their native language is, so that Hispanic and Asian English language learners will benefit from being in a dual immersion classroom. Native English speakers also benefit from learning the language of people that they will be working with as teenagers and adults. So a global focus and an emphasis on multilingual education we thought was also important.
That's an excellent point. Thank you for sharing that. What I was going to say about that, I think we've had some really good success in the early learning space. The Department of Early Care and Learning has been working with different dual immersion kind of programs that show really good outcomes, especially for the Spanish speakers in particular, but other languages as well. And in the section, I know all of you are just chomping at the bit to dive into the hundreds of pages that Steve mentioned earlier that Caitlin and I produced. When we look at adequate and equitable funding, we're also talking about resources. And one of the things that we were looking at is that if you look at where teachers who are certified in ELL, certified to teach English language learning, they are disproportionately represented in schools of upper income. They're underrepresented in schools of high minority and high poverty. And so as we talk about equitable resources and how those are dispersed and where the need are, I think as a policy, both at the state level and within districts and within schools, we really have to look at how that is building the foundation that we're looking for. Other thoughts? Yes, ma'am.
I'm sorry. Hi, my name is Reagan Edwards. I am a candidate for House District 37, and education is one of the top issues on my platform. I'm in the Marietta area, and it includes some of unincorporated Cobb County. And foundations for learning would be, I think, number one. And I think if local businesses in the community got together more often and increased the quality of life in that area, that would be great. We have a lot of events in Cobb County that brings the community together, and that helps people meet their neighbors and find more resources that are in their local community. I also feel that affordable early childhood education is top of the list as well, especially out in Cobb County where there's not a lot of transportation. There's not a lot of way for people to get to jobs in Atlanta. And they need an affordable early childhood education as well as the transportation to get to these jobs that would allow them to thrive.
Thank you very much. And we are about at time for this section of the program. So in a second, I'm going to throw it back over to our president, Steve Dollinger. But I'd just like to thank you for your attention and for your participation. And I find it interesting and gratifying that most of the stuff that we surfaced here, just sort of anecdotally, around a strong educational pipeline had very little to do with what was actually happening in schools. We talked about housing, transportation, appropriate resources, and roles for all of us and the community and how we engage. And so thank you very much for your attention, and I'm going to turn it over to Steve.
How about a round of applause for Dana? Dana, as we call her. Good job, Dana. Thank you. And thank you, everyone, for being here. This is exactly what we had hoped for, to have this kind of a conversation, to arm you to go back out to your communities and to be able to continue this kind of work and get more specific, trying to convene groups, connect groups together, and have those kinds of conversations. 3 things real quickly. 1, these slides are on our website. Sorry I didn't say that earlier to make you have to take all those pictures. Plus Delta for Macon, I'll remember to say that up front. The video of this meeting will be on our website the first of next week. So I encourage you to go back if you want to look at some pieces, or if you have some friends, colleagues that weren't able to be here, they could go back and see that. And lastly, there's still some materials, particularly some literacy materials on the table. So if you want anything else, pick them up. The electronic copies of all this is on our website also. With that, I'd like to introduce our vice chair of our board for the partnership, Mike Donnelly, who is the president of Atlanta region for Wells Fargo, and he'll close us out. Mike.
Thanks, Steve. So first of all, it was a great morning. I think we're all here for some personal reasons. I'll share a couple of mine real quickly. So first of all, I grew up in an education family. My mom was a teacher back when they used to call them librarians. I guess that's changed dramatically since those days. My oldest sister is a retired teacher as well. And we've got 3 children who are in the Fulton County public schools, so public education is really important to me. Another reason, which quite honestly, a lot of days stands above all others, is my wife. When she was in high school, Steve was her principal. So, so whatever Steve wants, Steve gets. That's right, gotta keep mama happy. During the day, I do work for Wells Fargo, and we're focused on 2 things I think that are really relevant. One is community development, and the second major area is education, closing the education gap for K through 12. We'll continue to do that work. In our breakout group, I found a lot of new reasons and more commitment on how we can continue to do that. But I think the last thing that I want to say is that in a world of where we've all focused so much on differences, I think today is a wonderful day to talk about what we share in common, and provides what I would call a nice booster shot for all of us to get back out there, remind us how meaningful the work we do is, although we all do it a little bit differently, and to focus on what we share in common, the common ground and the common good. And so, Steve, thanks for you and your team for providing that booster shot and that reminder for us that the work we do is worthwhile work, and committed to do it, and I'm sure we'll see you all here a year from now. So thanks again. Appreciate it.